over the years, we'd seen that there seemed to be a correlation, if not a more direct connection between the character of the individuals that we all knew in the business world and the bottom line and the results they got. It just seemed like high character people got better business results. So the more we talked about that, and at that time, Dan Goleman's book on emotional intelligence just
Hmm.
had its popularity, and we both knew Dan, and we thought that Dan's onto something, but we think there's a deeper form of intelligence, that emotional intelligence and all the influencing skills rest upon, and that's something we ended up calling moral intelligence. We actually met with Dan and talked that over with him, and he agreed that made sense, and actually endorsed our book. We then did a lot of background research. We figured we probably weren't the first guys that had ever thought about this concept of moral intelligence, and of course it goes back to ancient Greeks and all of that.
Yeah.
So for a couple of years, we hired a researcher who just scoured the literature and tried to find out everything there was written about morality and moral development and all of that. And that got us into the neurosciences, where we discovered the power of habit. And it also got us into the field of cultural anthropology, much to our
Hmm.
surprise. Well, there's a book that was published in, I think, 1989 called Human Universals. It was published by a cultural anthropologist professor. And basically what it is just an encyclopedia of the behaviors that are common to all human societies around the globe. It's what people in every culture teach their children. And it
Hmm.
turns out, if you look at all this list of behaviors, they're things like telling the truth and keeping promises and owning up to your own mistakes and being responsible for your personal choices and showing forgiveness and compassion, kindness to other people, especially those in your tribe and your family. And as we looked at all of those, we reasoned that, there's a theme here. You can pick out themes. And we came up with 4 themes: integrity, responsibility, forgiveness, and compassion. And we realized that if these are universal, that all human societies teach them, they really are moral principles, that these behaviors rest under the umbrella of these moral principles. And that's how we came to write this book called Moral Intelligence. Um, we came up with a leadership model. It was based on these 4 universal moral principles, and interviewed a lot of people that we respected as senior people, and wrote this book called Moral Intelligence. It was published by Wharton Business School Publishing, and it's in 7 or 8 different languages. Actually, it's in the 2nd edition. It's still doing well in many parts of the world. But about 6 months after that book was published, I got a call from a reviewer, and he said, "Fred," he said, "I need to give you a lesson in economics." And I said,
Hmm.
"Oh, yeah, what's that?" He said, "Well," he said, "I read your book and all that soft stuff you talk about. I know you think that's important, and I did expect that because you're a psychologist. But let me tell you, that's not what accounts for. It's nice to have, but it's icing on the cake. Because the only thing that really creates value is a good business model. If you have a good business model, you'll make a ton of money, especially if you happen to have a tailwind. And you can attract all the good talent that you want from making a lot of money. And all that nice stuff you say is so important will kind of come along for the ride, usually." He said, "Even if it doesn't, as long as management stays legal," he said, "that's all that's really required." But he said, "Everything you think is so important," he said, "is just icing on the cake. It's not really, doesn't contribute any value." And he said, besides, he said, "I read your book." He said, "You make all these incredible claims of how important that stuff is, but you don't have any data to support your claim. All you did was talk to a lot of people that agreed with you." Well, I got off the phone and I was pretty discouraged for about 10 days or 2 weeks, thinking that I had devoted my entire career to icing on the cake. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to me that my experience was that it is an important factor. But this guy was right. I don't have any data. So set me on the mission to get the data. I thought I know a lot of CEOs. I bet you they'd be glad to cooperate in a research study, especially, if we find that this is really important, then it's something that we can take to business schools and say, hey, you need to add this to your curricula. And CEOs were eager to sign up for this. So I optimistically thought it would take me 2 years. It ended up taking 7 years
Wow.
had the book ready for publication. But over that 7 years, we signed up 121 CEOs, ended up with complete data on 84 of them. And complete data meant that we had conducted a random survey of randomly selected employees,
Mm-hmm.
asking them questions about the CEO and the senior team around these four moral principles. How often do they show integrity? How do they tell the truth, keep their promises? How often do they demonstrate responsibility, owning up to their own mistakes, expressing concern for the common good? And how often do they demonstrate forgiveness towards other people? How do they react when people make mistakes? And finally, do they show compassion? Do they just treat people as people? Do they care for the workforce as human beings? And we ended up with over about 8,500 randomly selected employee surveys with that 7 years. And so
Wow.
that allowed us to identify those CEOs and senior teams that their employees thought that they were just terrific people to work for. They were high character in all four of those dimensions. And there were another group of CEOs that scored very low on those dimensions. Now, what was really interesting is that, well, a lot of it was really interesting, but what was really interesting is that both CEOs whose employees rated them very highly and those CEOs whose employees rated them very lowly, they both rated themselves highly. They both thought of themselves as being people with high character.
Meaning the CEOs that were rated poorly by the employees thought of themselves as actually having high character.
Absolutely. Their intentions were good. And when it was part of our research agreement is that we would show them the data that we collected from their employees, give them a report. And when we gave a report to the high scoring CEOs, they thought, yeah, that makes sense. I kind of figured I'd score that way. When we showed the same report to those that scored low by their employees, they were astonished and they were horrified. They were distressed. They didn't. This is not how I see myself. How can they view me? How can they view me as a person who lies, who cheats, who doesn't tell the truth, who treats them like objects? They were just horrified by that and wanted to do something about it. So